Good afternoon, good morning and good evening. My name's Joji Waits, the Head of Flight Safety at British Airline Pilots Association, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this third BALPA-hosted event in a series of safety-themed webinars. Although the current reopening of international travel, at least from a UK perspective, may not have been as comprehensive as we'd have liked, it's still true that many people are returning to work in an unfamiliar, complex environment, having spent a large amount of time away. With this in mind, our focus today will be on the very pertinent issue of fatigue. And whilst aimed at pilots and airline safety management practitioners, the general themes will resonate across all aviation domains and beyond into other industries. Our speakers today will highlight the nature of fatigue, not just as an ultimately subjective issue from an individual pilot's point of view, but also from an operator safety management perspective through an appreciation of the capabilities and limitations of the latest tools and technology. We had also planned to cover flight crew wellbeing today, but unfortunately our speaker, Paul Cullen, had to drop out this morning owing to an urgent family-related issue. So our thoughts are with him. Apologies for this, but we do intend to interview Paul on a one-to-one basis at a later date, and we will post a recording on our website. So please feel free to share with us any questions relating to wellbeing you have, and we can pass those to Paul to answer. So the format for today is now a series of 3 presentations, followed by a panel Q&A session at the end. We'll be taking a brief break after the second presentation and aim to finish around 4 p.m. UK time. There will also be an opportunity for an informal post-event online discussion, and we'll say a bit more about that later this afternoon. This leads to a brief bit of housekeeping for you. Those familiar with Zoom will know there's a chat function. So please use this to chat amongst yourselves or to make observations as we go along. However, for specific questions aimed at our speakers, please use the dedicated Q&A function. There will be opportunities for questions briefly after each presentation and with more time available during the dedicated panel session at the end. Also, to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be made available on the BALPA Safety Conference website together with the presentation slides. Given the number of people online, we've had to mute and turn off cameras for those that are not speaking. You haven't given up your valuable time today to hear me go on, so we'll get on to the main event shortly. But before that happens, I cannot end this introduction without expressing my gratitude to our speakers for the generous time and efforts in preparation and appearing here today. Special thanks also to my colleague James Burnell for his stellar work in putting this event together. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Paul Jackson, who will set the scene with an explanation of the fatigue challenges that we face, together with thoughts on how things can be improved. Paul, founder of Fresh Air Training, is a chartered psychologist specialising in human performance, and for the last 20 years has assisted safety critical organisations in implementing fatigue risk management systems, or FRMS. A JAA training organisation approved trainer, Paul has written industry guidance on FRMS and delivered fatigue risk management training to safety teams from over 100 airlines and representatives from over 20 regulatory authorities. Paul, the floor is yours. You're muted, Paul.
There we go. Okay, thanks so much indeed, Joji, for that introduction. We are at a time now, obviously, that things are starting to change again, hopefully for the better. We've had a very difficult 15 months or so, and fatigue probably hasn't been high on people's agenda with all the other awful things that have been happening. But for me, now is a time for reflection and also an opportunity to improve things. And my presentation today essentially conceptualizes this in the form of what I call FRM 2.0. And I believe that now is the time to raise the bar in terms of how we manage fatigue. So to give you my 1-minute overview of my presentation, if we think about how the aviation industry has managed fatigue, over the last 15 years or so, there have been some significant improvements, both in the way that fatigue is managed at a regulatory level, in the understanding that operators have of the contribution that their practices make to fatigue, but also in the tools that are available. And we'll hear about some of those this afternoon. But despite all those improvements, it's my belief that operational practices are still the main or primary cause of fatigue for most crew. And the reason for this is that operational demands require that operators behave in a particular way, that we operate at certain times of the day, and that those particular operational practices can increase the fatigue challenge for crew. But there's also, in my view, a general lack of understanding of just how significant a problem obtaining sleep can be for crew, particularly when working particular types of duty. And there's also perhaps a lack of understanding of the true impact on well-being caused by this fatigue. The last 12 months or so have brought mental health and well-being into sharp focus, and with the possibility that there will be some return to near normality in the not too distant future, it's my belief that now is the time for a more proactive approach to fatigue risk management. So just to backtrack a little, if we think about how fatigue was traditionally managed, going back 20 or 30 years, fatigue management was very much seen as the responsibility of crew. And working in other industries, I still see that this is the prevalent approach. You, as an employee, have a responsibility to arrive fit for duty. With the advent of fatigue risk management, particularly with the ICAO recommendations and guidance that were developed first in 2011, and the subsequent impact that had on regulatory approaches, particularly at EASA and the FAA, airline operations were required to take a more proactive approach to how they managed fatigue. And this essentially began with the idea that they need to have better understanding of the contributors to fatigue. So what is it that we as an organization do that causes fatigue? In other words, what about our operational practices? How do our operational practices increase or elevate fatigue risk? And because there was an increasing requirement to understand, there was an increasing emphasis on the science behind fatigue. And that involved collecting operation-specific data to help organizations identify the specific hazards associated with their operational practices. There was also an increased emphasis on shared responsibility. So this approach to managing fatigue, I conceptualize as FRM 1.0. And for the last 10 years or so, this has been the desirable approach. In other words, it's the approach that all organizations are trying to move towards. I mentioned shared responsibilities there, and I think there are clear responsibilities for the authorities, for the operations themselves, and for crew. The national aviation authorities in each country are responsible for providing the regulatory framework, but also ensuring that operators are managing their specific fatigue-related risks, that they understand them, and that they are doing everything they can to achieve an acceptable level of safety. Then, turning to the airlines themselves, they have a responsibility to provide education, to develop pairings and rosters that enable crew to perform safely, and for putting in place processes for both monitoring and managing the fatigue hazards inherent in their operation. And then our crew have a responsibility still to arrive fit for duty, to make the best use of the opportunities they have for obtaining sleep, but also for reporting fatigue hazards. And those hazards could originate either in the operation or external to the operation. But although we describe these as shared responsibilities, I think it would be wrong to assume that they are equivalent. In my view, operators should bear a greater responsibility for managing fatigue. And the reason for that is that much of what causes fatigue originates in the actual operational practices. So I believe that operators should be making efforts to minimize the extent to which those operational practices or those rosters elevate fatigue risk in the first place. And in addition, they should take greater steps to limit those practices, particularly those which make it difficult for crew to meet their responsibilities. We need to be setting our crew up to succeed rather than fail. So some examples of the kinds of operational practices that may elevate fatigue risk. One of the most obvious would be working at a time of the day when our bodies as humans are designed to sleep, night duties. And that, of course, results in us having to obtain sleep during the day. And we know from the science that daytime sleep will typically be inferior. It'll certainly be shorter. And for most people, it will be more difficult to achieve. But what about those duties that don't necessarily go through the night, but require a very early start? So early duties. An 0500 check-in requires a very early bedtime. But we know that trying to achieve sleep in the mid-evening is particularly difficult. So even where a crew member has tried to go to bed early and get a good night's sleep, if they're doing so at 8 o'clock in the evening, they're really going to struggle. And that's the result of circadian issues, that being the evening peak in alertness, but also social issues. Everybody else around is awake and active and noisy. And then there are transitions. I think a lot of organizations are trying to move away from these kinds of transitions, but where we are switching from earlies to lates, or even worse, from lates to earlies, this practice can again have a significant impact on the crew's ability to achieve sufficient and good quality sleep. But what about those rostering practices which are perhaps just thoughtless? A crew requested day off, for example. A crew member has requested a day off for a specific personal reason. And then they look at their roster and find that they've been rostered an early start immediately after that crew requested a day off. How does that make them feel? What impact does that have on their morale? What impact does it have on their loyalty and their job satisfaction? So many of these operational practices are caused by operational demands. But in my view, in some organizations, there's insufficient understanding of the true impact that these basic operational practices have on crew sleep and their subsequent performance. And this is evident when we talk to management and to crew. Regularly, I hear managers in all industries say things like, if people only did what we told them to do, we wouldn't have a problem with fatigue. We tell them, get sleep, but they don't. They're out shopping or socializing. The reality, in my experience, is very, very different. The vast majority of crew, particularly in aviation, are doing their best, trying their best to meet their responsibilities. And they'll tell me, I go to bed early, but I'm just lying there staring at the ceiling, worrying about not being able to sleep. And then we have the other situation where operators are perhaps using biomathematical models inappropriately. And by that I mean using a model to justify particular operational practices or to make decisions on crew reports. So a crew member submits a report and the model says that the roster's fine. So it must be a problem with the crew member. Maybe they're mismanaging their fatigue and their sleep. We know from surveys, particularly within BALPA, that fatigue is a significant issue. Nearly 9 out of 10 BALPA members say fatigue is a very important professional issue. The problem is that when we don't manage fatigue, it combines with stress and we get significant impacts on well-being. And if we look at all the different contributors to fatigue, for example, operational contributors, such as high workload, time pressures, schedules that are difficult to sustain for long periods, and then all the environmental factors, as well as the effect of sleeping in hotels, which aren't necessarily well designed for daytime sleep. So those operational contributors combine with roster contributors, features of the roster, which make fatigue more of a risk. So combinations of early starts, late finishes, trying to sleep at a time of the day when our alertness is high, or short notice roster changes, which have an impact on crew's personal life, or working on rest days, or relying or an over-reliance on the model. And then adding to that, all of those external factors, the things that the operation doesn't really have great control over. Those personal life stressors, dietary issues, health issues, all of the things that can have an impact on your fatigue before we even get into things like sleep disorders. And then other issues such as the limited availability for exercise because of the demanding nature of schedules, and equivalent access to healthcare for all individuals within the organization. All of these obviously cause stress and fatigue for crew. But where those two issues are not well managed, that's when we get experiences such as this, where crew experience mental well-being issues, and ultimately they experience burnout. And eventually they leave the industry, which is not good for anybody. For me, part of the problem originates in the language of the regulations. If we look at the basic regulation, ORO FTL 110, which describes operators' responsibilities, one of those responsibilities relates to scheduling, and specifically says when developing a workable roster, the operator should strike a fair balance between the commercial needs and the capacity of individual crew members to work effectively. Now, for me, that language is unhelpful because it places the emphasis on crew working effectively. In other words, you design a schedule which enables crew to work effectively. For me, it would be better for that regulation to focus on operations developing rosters that enable crew to achieve sufficient good quality sleep. So being very specific about the fundamental cause of fatigue, because it follows that if an individual is achieving sufficient good quality sleep, well, they're probably going to be working effectively. The reverse is not necessarily the case or true. And then if we turn to the more advanced fatigue risk management regulation, ORO FTL 120. Again, the language refers to the impact of schedules on sleep and fatigue, but also on performance. Here, I think there's an opportunity to expand that, to not just consider performance, but also crew well-being. And given the events of the last 15 months or so, certainly I think the time is ripe for regulations to give more consideration to the impact of operational practices on well-being. And this is reflected in the views of regulators. One regulator that I spoke to, who's extremely well thought of in terms of fatigue risk management, had this to say: I'm a little concerned that some operators are putting all the responsibility on the crew members. Some operators believe that promotion of some training and sleeping and eating strategies absolves them from managing fatiguing rosters through changing the timings. Robust barriers start with developing rosters that seek to manage the fatigue, not suggesting mitigations for poor rosters. And I think that's so true. Many organizations that I've worked with over the last 20 years have done great work to identify mitigations for fatigue, whilst allowing themselves to continue to do the very things that cause fatigue in the first place. And the reality is that for many organizations, the really true costs of fatigue are often hidden. Where an organization is focused on obtaining data and collecting data relating to incidents, or is focused on minimizing and managing reports of being unfit for duty, the full costs of fatigue remain unknown. An organization that is truly trying to do the best for their crew should be collecting data on a variety of fatigue's impacts. How fatigue impacts on issues such as crew well-being, but also on operational delivery, so the quality of service delivery, and things like the ability to retain staff. A fatiguing operation is likely to lose staff because of things such as burnout, as we described earlier. But then there are all those other operational consequences of fatigue, which perhaps sometimes just get accepted as part of doing the job. Those delays caused by fatigued crew. The fact that fatigued crew burn more fuel, or that fatigued crew make more hard landings. So some very real operational consequences. But for most organizations, these aren't calculated. But by doing so, the organization would have a much more informed understanding of the true costs of fatigue. And that better understanding provides evidence for change. And those organizations that I've worked with who have done this have made significant changes to their operation. And they have reaped the benefits, as have their crew. Now, some operations will tell me, well, we can't change the way we operate. This is the reality. We have to do this. And I don't think anyone's asking organizations to completely change the way they work, but at least to have more consideration for the impact on crew well-being. And some simple, small changes, incremental changes to things like duty start times and end times, to the nature of roster patterns, and to those operational practices that have an impact on fatigue, can have a very significant impact both on crew's ability to sleep, their experience of fatigue, the fatigue risk that's a consequence, but also on the morale and general well-being of the crew workforce. Some very basic things that we could think of. Slightly later start times on consecutive earlies, a forward rotating pattern. Many organizations already do this, obviously, but to have that at the forefront of our rostering practice, that this should be something we aspire to rather than we accidentally create a forward rotating pattern. And then many organizations provide great training, training on how to manage your fatigue, how to achieve good sleep. And Erin this afternoon will be telling us a little bit more about that. But perhaps we need to be focused on providing guidance which is tailored to achieving sleep on those more challenging duties. So rather than simply providing a generic sleep guidance program, fatigue training program, tailoring it to the specific nature of our operations. And then acknowledging that where a crew member has requested a day off, there's probably a very good reason for that, which probably means they don't want to be starting early after that day off. So delayed starts would be a very basic and simple to achieve change in practice. And then providing a better balance between blocks of work and blocks of rest. It's written in the regulations that this is something we should be aspiring to, but how many organizations truly do this? And by doing these kinds of basic, or making these kinds of basic changes, the organization can demonstrate much greater commitment to managing fatigue risk and for putting in place an effective fatigue risk management system. For me, all of this is encapsulated in what I call FRM 2.0, a more proactive approach to managing fatigue. Historically, when we talk about managing fatigue, we're talking about a negative state. Fatigue is not something that crew typically want to come forward and be open and honest about. And that's because it has negative consequences. And as a concept, it's a negative thing. In contrast, alertness is a much more positive approach. Alertness is something we all aspire to. We all want to be alert and awake and alive. So focusing on managing alertness is focusing on that more positive state. Managing fatigue is reactive, where we're simply responding to complaints about fatigue. We're responding once the issue has happened. Responding to reduced alertness and reports of reduced alertness is a much more proactive approach. By focusing on reduced alertness incidents, we can do things still. There are still opportunities for intervention. Whereas when somebody is reporting reporting fatigue, the data and the solutions are limited. Ideally, reporting fatigue would be a rarity, and so clearly there is going to be an absence of data. But where we encourage crew to report reduced alertness, in other words, where their alertness, their performance has been suboptimal, we can identify things that could be done to improve that alertness. In other words, we're taking action before the worst case scenario has happened, where someone has had to come off duty. So some organizations that I work with have changed their language. They talk about reporting reduced alertness rather than reporting fatigue. And their training program is designed to improve alertness rather than mitigate fatigue. And that simple change in language changes the culture within the organization. The organization starts to embrace this more positive approach. Crew feel more comfortable to be reporting reduced alertness. And the reality is that if we're simply focusing on managing fatigue, we're allowing those fatiguing operational practices to continue. Whereas focusing on a system that promotes alertness encourages us to develop schedules that promote alertness. So to summarize what I've been saying this afternoon, in my experience, whilst there have been significant improvements to the way that the aviation industry manages fatigue, to the extent that aviation is held up and celebrated by many other industries, it's still the case that many crew are exposed to high levels of fatigue. With the changes which are hopefully coming forward in the near future, returning to some form of normality, I believe it's an opportunity to redress the balance a bit. Because it's fair to say that when we don't manage fatigue effectively, and when it's combined with unmanaged stress, this combination contributes quite significantly to poor crew mental well-being. The regulations require that operators have an understanding of their operational practices and the extent to which these contribute to fatigue. And yet, despite that requirement, many organizations still persist with many of those operational practices which elevate fatigue risk, to the extent that, in my experience, these operational practices are the primary contributor to crew fatigue and stress. So perhaps some of these operators could be doing more to manage these issues. Whilst there is an emphasis within the regulations on shared responsibility, it's my belief that operators should have a greater burden of that responsibility, for the simple reason that they are responsible for many of the contributors to fatigue in the first place. And thinking about the regulations themselves, in my experience, or in my view, the language could be strengthened. And it could be strengthened by making specific reference both to crew well-being, but also to achieving good quality sleep. In other words, avoiding operational practices that negatively impact on crew well-being, or that have a significant impact on crew's ability to achieve good quality sleep. And if organizations have a better understanding of those impacts, then it gives them a reason to change, to try and improve the way they work. The last year or so has really made us think about crew well-being and well-being generally as a nation, as an industry as well, with the hope that in the near future there will be some kind of return to something approaching normality, and particularly given the increased awareness of mental health issues, I believe now is the time to take a more proactive approach to the management of crew fatigue. And that more proactive approach is encapsulated in what I call FRM 2.0, an approach which encourages us to think about promoting the positive, alertness, rather than simply reacting to the negative. Okay, I hope that's been useful. Thank you very much indeed for your attention. If you have any questions, I'll be very happy to answer them.
Thank you, Paul. Really excellent scene setter for a presentation, and thank you also for providing a succinct explanation of the evolution of FRM and where we are today. Particularly like the mind shift from managing fatigue to promoting alertness, kind of a safety 2 version of FRM, which really chimes in with the sort of themes we're trying to promote throughout conferences. We do have time for questions. I see we have one in the Q&A already. So I'll hand over to James to facilitate the Q&A. Thank you, James.
Thanks, Joji. Paul, could you stop sharing your screen for us?
Yeah, just in the process there.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, we'll kick off with a question from Stu Clark. For years, guidance and even FTL regs contained comments to the effect that rest periods of between 18 and 30 hours should be avoided. However, in my experience of flying both short haul and long haul, rest periods were often the norm. Such rest periods were often the norm, especially away from base. For example, short 3-day standovers arrive late on the first day and depart very early on day 3, equally transatlantic East Coast trips. If the science and guidance was so specific about the dangers of such rest periods, why are airlines allowed to get away with such integrations by the regulators?
You're expecting an answer to that, aren't you?
I know, that's a big question.
I think it's a statement rather than a question.
Yeah, do they, I guess, do they look at the science to that extent, or do you feel they're possibly pushed a lot by the industry to make things that fit in operationally?
I think in many industries, it's the case that whilst there has been good consideration of the science at the regulatory level, it's also the case that the regulators have to be pragmatic.
Yeah.
So there is that sort of trade-off between allowing operators to operate, to function, but at the same time taking more consideration for the science behind fatigue. I'm not sure that we've got the balance right, to be fair.
Yeah.
And Stu's question really reiterates that.
Yeah, Stu's got his hand up actually. If I allow him to talk, he could ask I want to ask a question himself. Stu, are you there?
Hi, can you hear me?
You can.
Good to go.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Paul. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
I think there are some things, obviously, as you intimate, there are one or two types of trip that are flown, and perhaps that's the East Coast typical red-eye flights where you can't really see an easy way to avoid those sorts of difficult rest periods. But equally around Europe, with a lot of trips being flown backwards and forwards, it would be possible, but clearly more expensive for the airline. Perhaps they'd have to night stop people for that extra bit of time and break integrations such that perhaps instead of, say, for example, the one that was most obvious to me for many years was the short haul standover idea, where you would arrive perhaps after midnight on the first day, you'd get what looks like a whole day off on day two, and you'd be up extremely early, 3 o'clock wake up call on day three, but you'd then end up working to the kind of limit that the FTL allowed on day three too. So it'd be 3 sectors, culminating in a pretty late return to base after the 3rd sector. And obviously, Northern European winters being what they are, that could be quite a challenging day. So it's always seemed to me that there are some easy wins in this, and in the end, it always just comes down to the finance. It comes down to the cost. If you can take your crews out of the loop for a bit longer, they can achieve longer rest periods or perhaps shorter duty days after those more trying rest periods. But, I'm quite concerned now with the way aviation is, that we're going to see airlines burning the candle at both ends even more than perhaps they were pre-COVID. And it's something that we've got to get a handle on.
I think you're right, Stu. Perhaps though the issue is, as I said, the lack of data to demonstrate that there is a cost to those fatiguing practices. That's been, I think, an issue for many industries. If the data isn't there to demonstrate that it's costing the organization money, then you're right, all of those potential mitigations get labeled an additional cost. So putting crew up in a hotel is a cost. Avoiding the consequences of their fatigue on the impact on the operation or on the crew themselves is not factored in. And this is, I think, a real challenge for organizations to take a much more sophisticated and mature approach to the issue. In particular, calculating the true costs of fatigue and thinking, okay, what is this costing us? It's not just about avoiding incidents and improving safety. There are significant financial implications of not managing fatigue. And we can list those: the cost of replacing crew, the cost of more training, everything from recruitment costs to training costs to you name it. But none of those are factored in the bottom line. So that, I think, is a very basic starting point for many organisations.
Sure. Thanks for your time. It's much appreciated.
Welcome.
We've got another one here. So what do you feel is the main contributor to fatigue? Is it workload, circadian rhythm disruption, that sort of thing? I mean, I know in our airline, they concentrate a lot on workload. I don't know whether that's because that's easier to control, but do you think workload has a large impact or not?
I think the various contributors to fatigue, I mean, if we think about the principal contributors to fatigue, sleep quality and quantity, length of wakefulness, time of day, and workload, probably in that order. If you are managing the first three, then we can probably cope with higher levels of workload on an occasional basis. I think the challenge is where that workload is ramped up day after day after day, and crew are expected to suck it up and cope. That's when you get problems, because eventually people burn out and they struggle to cope over time. So crew, particularly in aviation, are mission focused and driven and determined to do their best, and they're their own worst enemies, sadly. You probably experienced that yourselves.
Yeah. Do you think there's the systems are out there to really pull in the contextualized data to really highlight these points? I mean, we've got Boeing Jefferson next to speak, so I don't want to say too much, but
I think in my experience, certainly Jefferson and the people who work with Jefferson are very good at having that detailed understanding of the fatigue issues, but also having that understanding of operational practices and particularly rostering practices. Thomas Clements particularly I would hold up as someone who I've always admired as someone who really understands the operational demands, the practicalities. Yeah, that's the kind of person I would want advising me. I should say I have no allegiance to any of the biomathematical model providers, but that's just one example.
all right. How far upstream in the planning processes do you think you should go to look at fatigue? Because I think a lot of airlines are looking at rosters, but maybe not all the way back through pairings possibly, or even system design in the first place.
I think, yeah, the further back you can go, that's one of the challenges. I think, commercial departments make decisions without consideration of fatigue because perhaps they don't understand fatigue. And when you sit a commercial department down and say, okay, well, these are the things you're proposing, and this is the impact it's going to have on our crew. And this is the cost. Are you still prepared to make that demand for that particular practice or pairing, whatever? Most organizations don't do that, sadly.
Yeah. So what do you think the limits are that the airlines can manage? I mean, obviously there's a shared responsibility there, and we definitely need to, Balpa feel that we need to make our crews aware that there is a responsibility there from their side as well, to manage themselves. But yeah, actually, I think you answered that question pretty much, to be honest. But yeah, do you think there are limits on what the airlines can do, and if it is, what should the crews be looking for when they reach those limits?
It's a tricky question. I think better understanding is fundamental, and in many organizations there is a requirement for changing culture. If you're starting out from the perspective that crew are making unnecessary demands, or crew don't do as they're told, you're probably starting from the wrong position. Mm-hmm. I've worked with organizations who have used models, for example, to make decisions on fatigue reports. If the model says there shouldn't be a fatigue issue, then that crew member loses their pay for that day. That's never going to result in a positive culture or a healthy reporting culture. I should say that wasn't in the UK, but that's the kind of practice that really has to be struck out. Developing a much more trusting atmosphere, where a crew member who submits a report of fatigue is A, believed, and B, thanked for being honest and open. That's the starting point for me.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much for that. That's pretty much the questions I have for the moment. We're going to join us at the end for question and answers, but I'll hand you back to Joji for the next section.
Excellent. Thanks, James, and thanks, Paul, for taking those questions. Yeah, as James said, there'll be further opportunities. So if you think of anything, or if you have some questions that you didn't get a chance to ask, stick them in the Q&A, and we can collate those for later in the session. So with Paul having set the scene so effectively, I'm now delighted to introduce Arvid Mullen, who will talk about fatigue from an airline perspective, including how they can make positive difference with optimized scheduling processes and tools. Arvid is a scheduling specialist at Boeing Sweden. He has spent a decade working with various aspects of crew scheduling across dozens of airlines, with the past 6 years focused on fatigue risk management. Over to you, Arvid.
Thank you, Georgie. Yeah, so hello, everyone. Yeah, I was invited to give an airline perspective on fatigue. Now, of course, I don't represent an airline, but a vendor for airlines. But perhaps that puts me in a better position to talk about the airline perspective than the airlines themselves, since, well, I'm not here to defend any practices. On the contrary, my job here at Boeing and Jeppesen is to tell airlines that they're not good enough. So I hope I will have the right angle on this. Now, of course, I'm talking about an airline perspective, but my airline perspective, it's kind of centered on the crew scheduling box, because that's where we're mostly working. But I will try to broaden the view as well and include some aspects of more pure flight safety and also the commercial aspects. Starting out with some basics. What is fatigue to an airline? Well, first and foremost, it's a regulatory requirement that you need to manage. It's also a risk, an operational risk. You may have accidents and incidents that are caused by fatigued staff. And thirdly, fatigue is a source of costs and general trouble from a well-being perspective. Fatigued crew are unhappy. Fatigue leads to unhealthiness of various kinds, and it leads to lower performance. So we have three aspects to fatigue from the airline perspective. Now, looking one step ahead at what is fatigue itself, then I think it's very important to realize that fatigue is not a binary thing. It is not you're fatigued or you're not fatigued. It exists on a spectrum. And it also exists on multiple levels or periods of time. You will have some level of fatigue on a particular flight. You will have some level of fatigue during a particular duty, during a trip, or across an entire roster. And there is, of course, I mean, sometimes you will have a fatigue situation that is so bad that you can say that, well, this is binary. In this case, this is purely wrong. This may, under no circumstances, be flown, even though it may perhaps be legal, or maybe not. But in general, what I'm focusing on here in this presentation is not so much the extreme cases or the actually illegal cases, but the big specter of fatigue that you have. And there's because I would say in the vast majority of operations, you only have a fairly small number of extreme fatigue situations. But it is very common that you have a very large number of flights where you have a, well, concerning but not catastrophic fatigue situation. And just by the vast numbers of these, I mean, in a mid-sized airline, you might have 5,000 flights per month where you have a somewhat concerning level of fatigue, a level of fatigue worth mentioning. You have 5,000 of those, and maybe you have 8 or 12 really bad flights. And if we look at how the risk develops, then of course, we have a sort of quadratic component to fatigue risk. There's a large specter where, well, you are somewhat tired, but you're still performing well. And then you reach a point where you start actually performing badly in an objective manner. And as you get more tired after that, risk shoots up exponentially. So of course, those few really bad flights, they are important to deal with because they represent an outsized risk by themselves. But still, if you have 10 of those and you have 5,000 of the others, you actually probably have a larger risk to your operation as an airline from the 5,000 somewhat concerning flights than you have from the 10 really bad ones. And I mean, this is an important insight to carry with you when you work with fatigue, that doing like spot checks or spot fixes rather is not going to revolutionize the risk situation. You need to look much broader to really deal with risk. Yeah, so how does this fatigue enter into your operation? Well, just repeating some basics here, but it's worth repeating. Fatigue is caused by how long have you been awake, what time of day is it, and of course, what is your day if you're transitioning across time zones, and what is your sleep debt. With those three things, we can explain the vast majority of fatigue. Workload is a factor, but well, in our view, it comes far behind these other ones. At least if we stay within reasonably normal types of operations. Of course, if we're talking about, say, you're a riot police officer, and you're doing a 12-hour day managing a riot, well, okay, that kind of workload, that's taking a toll. You're flying with an engine out, yeah, okay, now you're taking a toll. But just being at work, normal day, even if it's a long day at work, in a normal situation, that is a fairly minor factor. So with these insights, we can say fatigue risk is low. If you're well rested, it's during the day, your biological day. And important addition, you're performing an easy mission because your fatigue is not standing by itself as a risk, at least not when we're talking about significant short-term fatigue issues. Fatigue is a component in an overall risk picture. Looking from the other end, your fatigue risk is high if you have sleep debt, if you've been awake for a long time, if it's during the window of circadian low, middle of the night, and in particular, if you're doing a difficult mission at the same time, then your fatigue state forms a quite significant risk. Yeah, so that's the fatigue. And what drives this onto the pilots and the cabin crew is essentially the business model of the airline. So your business model, that decides when you're flying, where you're flying, how you're flying. Your business model is essentially what defines your timetable, which in turn defines what aircraft rotations look like and what the crew schedules look like. And if we look at these hypothetical examples I have on the screen here of some extreme examples, I mean, you might be flying really long flights. Just a big one go from 7 in the evening to 6 in the morning. Or you have a quick succession of short flights during the night. Maybe you're doing mail flights or something like that. Or you're flying just during the day. This is the essential driver for the fatigue situation in an airline. Of course, it's theoretically possible to put, well, basically any type of flight into a good enough context that you don't have a major fatigue issue. Possibly with the exception of flying during the window of circadian low, which is problematic unless you go to really extreme lengths. But it becomes very expensive trying to do something about this. I mean, if you have 4 flights that need to take place between 11 in the evening and 6 in the morning, well, you could imagine that you assign 2 pilots or maybe 3 pilots to each of those flights, and the rest are just being ferried around so that you can maximize. But that's not going to work. In practice, you're going to have schedules that go fairly close to what the rules allow. Not maxing it out completely, but the purpose of having an airline is to make money. If you're not making money, there's no point in having the airline. So your schedule is going to be pushing fairly close to what your timetable requires. It's worth taking a look at how the crew schedule is made. So as I said in the previous flight, or in the previous slide, crew schedule is a consequence of the timetable. And to some degree of the aircraft rotations as well, because the aircraft tends to be prioritized higher than crew because they're more expensive. So essentially, when we make a schedule, we have a bunch of inputs. First of all, timetable. Second, we have a set of aircrafts that follow some type of rotation. We have a set of crew who have various properties. Well, qualifications, recencies, they will be based at some particular base. And we have a set of rules that must be followed. Those rules, they will be both regulatory rules and various robustness and quality rules made up by the airline. These factors are put into some kind of computational machine, and the machine, well, it doesn't have to be a computer. It could, especially for smaller operators, for sure be a bunch of humans who take these factors into consideration and lay out rosters by hand. But anyway, you put in the factors you have into the machine and out comes crew schedules. This is not a completely mechanical translation here, because there are a lot of factors to consider that are difficult to capture with rules. So we will have a collection of knobs to turn here, where we decide what the trade-offs are. And this is the same if you have a manual planning process as it is in an automated planning process. It's just that how you express things will be slightly different. If you have human planners, you can tell them, okay, please don't make the connection times too short, because then we're going to miss the connection and it's going to be a big mess for everyone. If you're going to tell the same thing to a computer, you have to be a bit more specific. But still, you have the same factors in both cases. You have all the knobs to turn. Push a bit harder to make the schedule more robust. Avoid missed connections. Quality factors. We really want the cabin crew to speak Spanish when we're flying into Spain. Factors like that. And costs, of course. They come in as a knob here as well. How much are the quality factors allowed to cost? Will we ferry someone on a positioning flight down to Spain just to have another Spanish-speaking cabin crew? Maybe we will, maybe we won't. Depends on the on how much it's worth to use an airline, which comes back to your business model. Are you a high service airline or a low service airline? This is a very simplified view, because it doesn't happen in just one stage, this, that you put everything in and out comes the schedules. What actually happens is that we do this in multiple stages. And here we're reading from right to left, but for historical reasons. You do the same planning, or not the same, but you do planning from a very long-term perspective. This is usually called manpower planning. We might be a year out, 2 years out from actually flying, when we're thinking of, okay, we have some kind of idea what timetable we want to have in 2 years. So how much crew do we need in 2 years? Do we need to hire people? Do we need to promote captains? Do we need to do qualification training to move people between fleets? In which bases should we have which amount of crew? All of these things, they come out, I mean, from pretty far out from when you're flying. But they are still part of the planning. They still have the same inputs to a large degree. You still have some idea of the timetable, some idea of what your fleet will be like, some idea of what the rules allow you to do, and some idea of what your crew need is, or what crew you have available. And in this manpower planning stage, this applies to the commercial department as well, of course. You're thinking of, you want to add destinations. Well, do you have the crew for it? Do you have the right aircraft? Next step on, we have crew pairing. And this will be happening maybe 2 months out from flying, maybe 1 month out, depending a bit. And in this stage, we're not really dealing with specific people yet. A crew pairing or a crew trip or a crew rotation, lots of different terminology, depending on where you're at. This is when you look at the timetable and you say, you find an efficient combination of flights. Like, okay, we have a flight leaving London at 8 in the morning, going to Manchester, and then we have another flight from Manchester to Oslo at 11 o'clock. Okay, these make a nice combination. So you pair them up, building up duty days and building up entire trips. Not assigned to anyone in particular, just efficient and legal combinations of flights, which you then in the next step in rostering assign to specific people. In rostering, you also assign other things than pairings. Training. Training is partly a parallel process, but to a fairly large degree. Training activities are assigned in the rostering phase. So you have your collection of trips, and you know that these trips, they cover the entire production that we need to have. So we just need to assign them to people. And then, of course, each individual have particular qualifications that allow or don't allow them to fly something. There will be recency requirements for various destinations. So you need to keep track of if someone is running out of recency, and then prioritize pushing travel to those destinations there. If you have a preferential bidding system, then, well, those preferences should be taken into consideration here, and many other things. And finally, at day of operation, it's once again the same thing. You have the same inputs and need to maintain the schedules. You already have some schedules published, but of course they always change. There's always something. Then you have this long period between rostering and day of operation that we usually call roster maintenance phase, where you have, well, someone breaks a leg and you know 2 weeks in advance that, no, well, they won't be flying this. And then more things happen. Weather happens. You get congested airspace, leading to delays. You have mechanical issues. And tail swaps. Your flight is overbooked. Okay, let's put a bigger aircraft on this route then. And a lot of things follow. In all of these stages, we have plenty of opportunity to make the fatigue situation worse than the baseline dictates. Realistically speaking, we don't really have much opportunity to make things better than what your basic timetable and business model requires. But there's plenty of opportunity to make things worse. Starting all the way back in the manpower planning. If you fail to have balanced ranks across your airline, you have too few first officers or too few captains, or not enough people trained for Airbus 340s and too many for Airbus 320s. If you don't get these things right, you have an unbalanced crew resource situation, which means that moving forward into pairing, you will need to push people harder. You will need to push more production onto fewer people. And this is not only a problem with regard to fatigue, it's a problem for all the aspects that you want to deal with. It's a problem for the robustness of your schedules. It will be a quality problem if you can't put the type of people that you want to have on particular flights. In the pairing phase, now this is where, the actual combinations of flights are put together. And this is probably the place where we have the largest possibility to make an impact on fatigue, positive and negative. Aside from changing the business model of the airline, pairing construction is where everything happens that's interesting. This is really where you define how efficient your operation will be, how fatiguing it will be, how robust it will be and what kind of quality you can offer. And examples of problems you can introduce in pairing. I mean, maybe you have a backwards rotation of duty start times so that you start earlier and earlier for each day of the trip. If you have that problem, it has been introduced in pairing most likely. Acclimatization issues. If you have long trips crossing time zones, like we have in cargo operations, where we have sometimes 7 or 8 or 9 day trips where you're just going across the globe, back and forth, up and down. Acclimatization becomes really challenging. Also in more normal passenger-oriented operations, acclimatization can become an issue. And you can do clever things here to make it work in your advantage. Especially if you have lots of crew bases to choose from. You can choose if a trip that needs to go from Singapore to New York, from New York to Anchorage, and from Anchorage to Tokyo. I mean, where should it start? Should we take crew from New York to do this? Should we take crew from London? There's lots of possibilities here of doing good choices, but plenty of opportunity to screw things up. Misalignment with aircraft rotations typically will start around here. Then it can get worse during the day of operation because things happen. But if you have crew who have to change aircraft too much, or if you have crew that can't stick together because you've planned your flight deck and your cabin crew separately, and you haven't aligned them so that, well, maybe their pilots are following the aircraft, but they have to switch cabin crew at various points. Well, this relates to fatigue as well, to some degree, but in particular, it relates to quality and efficiency. And if efficiency is lacking, then you have to push crew harder in order to make up for it. And then comes fatigue as a consequence. Now in the rostering phase, yeah, plenty of opportunities here as well. Baseline is set by what you've done in pairing, but still, if you have multiple difficult trips, they might be possible to combine in a legal manner, but not an appropriate manner. So not having enough room between the trips, that's a problem that happens in rostering. We have issues with crew preferences here. If you manage, I mean, if crew are allowed to register preferences for which times of day they prefer working, then this is the place where you either manage to follow people's preferences or you fail to follow them, assigning night duties to morning people and vice versa. Very common problem relates to training planning. You have a schedule that at its base, just considering the trips on it, actual flying, looks pretty good. But then you need to squeeze in a bunch of training. And that gets squeezed in, say, in the afternoon before a late night flight, blocking tactical sleep opportunities. So you can't get that good afternoon nap because there was a training that was scheduled on there. Yeah, and then day of operation, plenty of sources of fatigue. Some of them are, well, there's really not much you can do about it. You have bad weather, you have to, or a congested airport. You have to circle for an hour, and that's an hour that you're not having rest opportunity. Not that much we can do in advance. Hotel management, that's an area where you as an airline can really screw things up by not being good at managing your reservations, by choosing bad hotels. I mean, that's a very severe and significant fatigue issue if you have a fairly short stop. And by plan, crew would have arrived at the hotel at, say, 11 in the evening to go to bed, but the airport hotel was overbooked or there was a mistake with the bookings. So now you have to get on a bus or in a taxi and go into a city hotel, and you probably lost an hour of potential sleep during that transition, and you lose more time in the morning again. So summing it up, each step of the planning process, you have opportunities to defend the fatigue situation and to make it worse. And in some cases, with clever use of multiple bases in different time zones, you can even like make a positive gain here. But mostly it's about defending what you have, and you have to do it in every step. Yeah. Now, so what can an airline do about this? And I would start with having knowledge, just having a look at what knowledge can you have as an airline, and which knowledge are you likely to have. I'm starting with a sort of worst case. So as an airline, what is your idea of the fatigue situation? Do you have a problem even? Well, you have fatigue reports perhaps. How many fatigue reports do you get? What proportion of your production is covered by fatigue reports? I mean, 0.1% of the flights in a month. That's what your feedback. And all your feedback is going to be outliers to some degree. This was one person at one time who was very tired. And most likely it will be a person who feels that it's clearly the airline's fault that they were tired. Otherwise, if they had a nagging feeling that this was a case of them not taking the responsibility that they should to maintain fitness for duty, if that was their feeling, they probably wouldn't have reported it. So having a bunch of fatigue reports, that's a bit of a worst case. It could be even worse, of course. It could be that you don't even have any fatigue reports. Well, in that case, now you're really flying blind. Of course, it's possible that you simply have a great fatigue situation, and that's why you don't have fatigue reports. Now, and I don't want to disparage the fatigue reports because the ones you get, they will tend to be important. So, I mean, treasure them and read them, and to the degree that it's at all possible, take action on them. But they will always represent just a small fraction of the fatigue that you have. They don't give an overview, an insight into what is the fatigue state in our operation. It's only tiny slivers of the operation that you get from that. Second part, this is typically called subject matter expert feedback, and it can come in different shapes. Many airlines have, well, the union have pairing review boards where they review different pairings. Unless you have a tiny operation, this doesn't really scale. I know of some very large European airlines who, well, try to keep up a pretense of reviewing all the pairings for their 25,000 crew, having a room full of union people who look at, well, God knows how many, 200,000 pairings a month. But of course, you have no chance of actually giving a good look at these. And still, it's just opinions. They are biased to the personal characteristics of those doing the review. I would say, I mean, disregarding some extreme outliers of like extremely problematic and very obviously bad scheduling patterns, you will not really get much actionable feedback this way. And third hand, you probably know that you're following the rules. Well, that's a start, but this is not really a good point to be if you want to be in control of fatigue in your operation. Now, best case, you still have the other things. You will still be talking to people, experts perhaps, on what your rosters look like. You will still have fatigue reports, and you're still following the rules. But to know what's going on, you need two more things. And in the best case, you have continuous fatigue surveys. So not just individual reports or high effort one-time survey. You have continuous surveys. A setup where crew can do a real quick report. And this is not just those who are tired. It should be every crew on every flight, perhaps limited to some part of your operation that is of concern. But every crew, every flight. Put it in an app, make it really easy. Just open the app, tap how tired you are. It takes 20 seconds. And in almost any type of operation, you can find 20 seconds per flight for this. It will be extremely rare that you just simply can't spare 20 seconds at any point during the flight. Now, if you have that, then you have a broad collection of data, lots of crew. You actually know the distribution. You had 250 people flying between London and Manchester last week on the morning flights. And you know the distribution. You know that, well, on average, people typically feel like this on that flight. We had a few who are this tired, a few who are extremely alert. There are potential issues here, say around trust. Maybe the crew don't want to give you this information because they don't trust you. There are ways to handle that. You can use an independent third party. Not going to mention the names, but someone who isn't the airline and isn't the crew, so that the data gets mashed up by an independent third party, and no one at the airline ever gets to see who reported what. They only get to know once they have 50 reports coming in on a particular, well, it can be a particular flight or a particular route, a particular crew base, whatever category you want. Once we reach 50 reports, then the airline gets access to a distribution for this. And it can be matched up with the flown rosters. That is one leg. So this is a broad insight into operational realities. Now, there are more limitations as well. Of course, subjective surveys like this, they are always subject to political meddling. People will be reported, or I shouldn't say will, but it's not impossible that there will be people reporting more tired than they are or more alert than they are in order to achieve some personal or political goal. There are limitations to that. So you need a second leg to stand on. You should need to have biomathematical models as well. And this is per the ICAO definition of a fatigue risk management system. It should be a blend of scientific principles and operational experience. And here, in our view, the operational experience should be large-scale data, not just point reports. And the scientific principles, at least from in a day-to-day perspective, is best served by biomathematical models. You can hire sleep scientists to do proper science in a manual fashion, but that is unlikely to scale. Once again, I mean, unless you have an extremely tiny or extremely regular operation where everything is always the same, it's just not possible to scale this so that you can get proper independent scientific review of your rosters in a way that gives you total overview. So you need biomathematical models as well. And the nice thing with them is they are comprehensive and objective. They are most certainly not perfect. And even a perfect model will still miss out on many aspects of reality. But a biomathematical model is objective and comprehensive. It will give you a fatigue score for every flight in every stage of the scheduling process. 2 years before you fly, when the commercial department is looking into timetable changes. You can take this draft timetable 2 years away from being flown. You throw it at an optimizer that will do a rudimentary pairing planning based on this draft timetable. It works for a few hours and it comes up with something like this is what's likely to be the schedule based on this timetable. You hand that to the biomathematical model, and then 2 years before you're flying, long before the timetable is even set, you get a feedback saying, okay, well, that's likely that you're going to have a fatigue hotspot over here and over here and over here. And these particular departures seem to be very difficult to schedule in a non-fatiguing way. And you can have a fact-based conversation this early. And this applies to the pairing construction, to the roster construction, and during day of operation. You can hook up the biomathematical fatigue model at every stage of the planning. And no matter if you're doing automated planning or manual planning, you can have biomathematical models hooked up everywhere and always have the objective and comprehensive view of fatigue from them. So of course, never trust the model in isolation. That's not how they're supposed to be used. The model predicts fatigue for a population of pilots, and it won't know the quality of the hotels. It won't know the noise level on the particular aircraft individual being flown. There's a lot of things it doesn't know. So the model must always be combined with operational experience of some sort, preferably by a very comprehensive operational experience via continuous fatigue surveys. So this is the best case of knowledge you can have. You have biomathematical models rolled out through the entire scheduling process, including interfacing to the commercial department. For this, you do need a pairing optimizer because it's not realistic to build complete pairings for draft timetables. It's too much work if you do it manually. But this is the best case on knowledge. And this is possible. This is stuff that, well, essentially any airline can have today if they want to. Now, armed with this knowledge, what can you do as an airline? And here I'm not including changing the business model. Of course, if you're a postal mail or air mail operator, the best way to improve the fatigue situation is to stop flying mail at night and instead fly regional business passengers during the day. But let's disregard that change and instead staying within the business model. What can you do? I'm going to say 5 things. First of all, have knowledge about the fatigue situation, proper knowledge. Already talked about how to achieve that, but that will be the starting point for essentially anything that you do. Number 2, be in control of the scheduling process. And essentially, this means having a well-staffed and well-designed automated scheduling process. For a smaller operator, it's possible to be in control with a manual process as well for scheduling, but it's impossible to scale. Number 3, have data-driven discussions. Now, this comes as a bit of a consequence of number 1 and 2. If you have knowledge and you are in control of the scheduling process, so you know the metrics ahead of time, the efficiency of your rosters is not a surprise at the end of the month after they were flown. It's something that you know of well in advance. Then you can have data-driven discussions. Inside the airline, between the airline and the regulator, between the airline and the union, you can talk about actual data. That is very useful if you want to be constructive. Number 4, use the right quantitative targets. Number 5, contextualize fatigue risk. Now, I'm going to give you a little insight into each of these points. Yeah, so being in control of scheduling essentially translates to using optimizers for pairing and rostering. If you use an optimizer, you can do scenarios in a way that's just not possible if you have when you have people manually laying out rosters. And these scenarios, they can cover all sorts of things. But I put up a couple of examples here. If you want to know what happens if you decrease some arbitrarily chosen minimum rest period that currently is 48 hours, what happens if we reduce it to 47 hours? Can we get some additional efficiencies from that? Will it have an impact on fatigue? It's going to be really tricky to have your hardworking scheduling department to try this scenario. So like, okay, you finished the rosters for this month, great. Okay, start from a blank slate and just see what happens if we work with this assumption instead. If you have an automated planning flow, you can make as many scenarios as you like. You can say, okay, I want to know for each increment of 15 minutes between 46 and 50 hours, what happens to fatigue and efficiency. And you throw it off to the computer and it works overnight. And the next morning, you have results for each of them. You can do across the board improvements if you use an optimizer. And this is not specific to fatigue, but if you have an optimizer and you have a fatigue model integrated, you can do things like, okay, let's see if we can reduce fatigue by 3%. Let's push it a bit harder. And this is not just extreme cases. This is all the fatigue in the entire operation. Seeing, okay, can we push it a bit harder? Getting slightly better combinations, taking some amount of cost. You don't have to know in advance what cost you're prepared to accept, because you can send out scenarios. You can ask it to try at 55 different levels of attempting to prevent fatigue in combinations in the pairings. And then you can just see how much each of them costs. Typically, you have a sort of inflection point where you push harder to avoid fatigue, or you push harder to get some other quality. And at the beginning, you get some nice improvements for essentially no cost in, and here by cost, I mean overall cost, not just cost in money, but in, since it's always a trade-off. If you want if you want longer connection times, you get less efficiency. If you want more consecutive day offs, you will have fewer crew with the right language qualifications available, etc. It's always a trade-off. You push somewhere, you push in one direction, and something else bulges out. But before that big bulging happens, there's usually these areas where you can push a little bit and get some meaningful gains before costs start running away. You can find these things if you use an optimizer. So it allows you to be in control. It means scheduling is not just something that happens to you as an organization. It's something where you set the targets and you get hard numbers back. Data-driven conversations. Yeah, once again, have a fatigue model connected to your scheduling system. And it doesn't even have to be a Jeppesen scheduling system or a Boeing alertness model. There are some competitors in the space. You can have AIMS with SAFE for that matter, but having a fatigue model tightly connected to your scheduling system allows you to have hard quantifications of any changes. You see it directly. If you make a change in the timetable, some change in the scheduling practices, you get immediate feedback with a hard number. Okay, this will reduce sleep, the predicted amount of sleep, by 5 minutes during this day if we do it like this, or by 2 hours. Get survey data. Yeah, this comes back to the knowledge section from before. There are plenty of fatigue issues that are beyond the reach of modeling. Get survey data for this. Conduct the surveys. Get the tools necessary to do large-scale surveys, and make sure that you know what your distribution of fatigue is like in the large. The experience and opinions of a few individuals is in general simply not good enough. There is too much bias and not enough bandwidth. Make sure all stakeholders have access to data. I mean, that's a fundament of having data-driven conversations. And this can be a bit scary, of course. But if you're from the airline perspective, you might want to hold on to the survey information because it gives you an advantage in negotiations, having knowledge about certain problems or certain areas where there isn't a problem. But if you want to have constructive conversations, if you want to move forward and make a change, then it's really powerful if all the stakeholders, both, and this goes inside the airline, that the commercial department and the scheduling department have insight in what the costs of different ways of doing things are. But also when it comes to union representatives, if everybody has the same data and that data is reasonably comprehensive, it will be much easier to have constructive conversations where you actually can agree on things to move things forward. Yeah, and this, I already mentioned the commercial department, but optimizers are a great way for crew scheduling and indirectly for flight safety to exert influence over the timetable. If you can turn around a draft timetable in a matter of hours or a day or two perhaps, and come back and say, this has this impact on flight safety, it has this impact on crew efficiency. Now, if you are able to come with that kind of feedback, then you have a seat at the table. Then you can make a difference and you have a reasonable chance of being listened to. Next one, having the right quantitative targets. Now, of course, all organizations set lots of targets. Just because you have targets, that's not a guarantee that anyone is actually working towards those targets. But it's better to be safe than sorry. If you're setting targets for things, make sure that it's not harmful to achieve those targets. Say, for example, you have the target, reduce the number of fatigue reports. Well, if you work towards this, likely outcome is fewer fatigue reports. Positive sides, less paperwork. Maybe there's also an improved fatigue situation. Maybe you did address underlying issues so that there's less reason to report fatigue. But more likely, perhaps, if someone is tasked with reducing the number of fatigue reports at the smallest cost possible, is that you simply reduce the number of fatigue reports without making a big change or for the better. And the outcome is instead that you simply just know less about fatigue. And it's not always obvious, these things. Say you have the goal of reducing average duration of night duties. That sounds good. It's bad working long hours at night, after all. If you work towards this, you achieve shorter night duties. But how did you achieve this shorter night duties? I mean, assuming that you didn't cancel flights, someone still has to fly these. So it's quite likely that in order to reduce the average duration of night duties, you simply put more people to work night duties. So now instead of having 2 pilots having their sleep disrupted one night, you have 4 pilots having their sleep disrupted. Those 4 pilots might individually be slightly less fatigued than the 2 pilots would have been otherwise. But now you have 4 people who didn't get to sleep. And this is, of course, once again one of those things that a fatigue model will not really capture the impact of that. But if you disturb people's sleep regularly, frequently, several times per week perhaps, over time, this is not good health-wise. Disturbed nights, disturbed sleep is a bad thing. And it can, both long-term and short-term, be a better idea to concentrate it, staying within certain limits and keeping things reasonable. So I won't go into all of these, but I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind, that what you aim for here, I mean, you need to make sure that aiming for something and then having someone else trying to achieve that in the easiest way possible can be a dangerous thing. Now, final piece of advice, contextualize fatigue risk. You have essentially 2 types of fatigue risk. You have the acute fatigue risk that comes from some particular people on a particular flight at a particular point in time being too tired to operate it in a safe way. I mean, that's the acute thing. That's not necessarily a long-term health issue. It is not a problem for a healthy grown-up to pull an all-nighter long-term. As long as you can recover and you don't do it too often, you can push yourself every now and then. Though it can be an acute safety issue during that night when you go into land. Maybe that's a safety issue. You should still contextualize this. So if we talk about acute risk, your fatigue metrics, the risk metrics from your biomathematical model, and perhaps from your surveys or where else you might have more operationally oriented classification of risk of particular flights. Don't treat them in isolation. Embed them into your existing risk assessments, making sure that if you're going to have people who are tired flying and you have 2 flights to choose from, make sure that the tired crew are on the easiest mission and the most well-rested crew on the most difficult mission. When talking about the long-term fatigue, the more health-oriented one, even though it's not just health, because having sleep issues has been mentioned before by Mr. Jackson, it has impacts on cost as well. And this is both acute fatigue and also in the long term. If you have developed sleep issues, other things follow: hard landings, increased fuel burn, etc. But your strategies for managing this probably shouldn't be the same. You have one way of dealing with acute fatigue on particular flights, and perhaps you need to have another strategy for dealing with the long-term fatigue, making sure that people get undisturbed nights as often as possible. So put your fatigue metrics into the right context. That will also help making constructive conversations of how to address things. And finally, a couple of just random notes that I couldn't fit into the other slides. Be careful when making rules. There are always side effects. I alluded to this with the target of reducing duration of night duties, but there are plenty of things like this. Minimum unbroken rest before a night duty. Well, it might seem like having 12 hours of rest instead of 10 would always be better. Whatever you can do in 10 hours, you can do in 12, and then some more. But that's not really how it works. When you're always pushing for efficiency, there will be inversions around this. So if you previously used to have a positioning flight at 9 in the morning to go somewhere and then have some rest before a night duty that is starting from not from your regular base, where you say, okay, that's annoying having to travel out at 9. We need longer times of rest before, so we need to have 12 hours. But the consequence of that might not be that the airline spends an extra duty day on flying you in the day before, and then having you spend the night in the hotel and having a full day on site before doing the night flight. The consequence is probably that there's going to be an earlier positioning flight. So instead of positioning at 9, now you're positioning at 7, and you've disturbed your night rest even more. There are always side effects to rules, so be careful when making them. And when you make rules, try to make rules that protect sleep rather than prevent work. And the logic of this is quite simple. It is sleep that prevents and makes you recover from fatigue. Work is not really driving fatigue, except for in extreme situations. It's lack of sleep that drives fatigue. So focus on protecting sleep, and you're more likely to get a good outcome of the rules that you make. Secondly, chronotypes, they really are a thing. There are morning people, there are evening people. People usually exaggerate or overestimate their own chronotype, but it's still a thing. Having a preferential bidding system can really help here. If you allow crew in a structured way to express if they want to work mornings or want to work early or late, some people will act against their own best interest, but in general, you can assume that people will choose what suits them. And if you allow people to have this type of influence on the rosters, you will get rosters that are better suited to the people who fly them. And with that, I've finished.
Thank you, Arvid, for another comprehensive and thought-provoking presentation there. I think the message that particularly resonated with me was the focus on protecting sleep rather than preventing work. It's a sort of reinforcement of what Paul was saying earlier, but also beware unintended consequences, whether you set targets or you focus in an area seemingly to address one issue, you're not transferring risk to another area that's greater. We have time again for some questions, so I'll hand over to James to facilitate those. And once we've completed them, we'll take a brief break. Over to you, James.
Thanks for that, Arvid. I think I have a lot of questions, and then you just answered most of them, so I don't know how long this is going to take. But Paul talked about quantifying the costs of fatigue. Do you think that can be realistically done with the current tech standards and the multiple systems a lot of airlines use for each little section of what they plan? I mean, have you seen an airline quantify it into monetary costs or all the way down to monetary costs, or is it just airline preferential preferences from the management?
I've never seen it done, and I think certain parts of it can probably be quantified. We've seen airlines have some success in doing correlations between fatigue predictions out of the models and correlating that with flight data monitoring. That happens, though it's really tricky making the strong correlations, because in the FDMs, well, I mean, in general, difficult winds is a bigger impact than fatigue. But there are cases when correlations can be made to hard landings and fuel burn. It's tricky to make it if we take an individual airline and make predictions that really hold and can be translated into dollar values. Yeah.
I mean, just along those lines, I mean, it's really interesting to hear the sort of importance of looking at fatigue all the way back through to even pairing schedules, creation of pairings rather, on that fatigue. I mean, have you gone into airlines which have purely been looking at rosters to try and protect fatigue and then gone back upstream and seen big noticeable differences in fatigue quality and obviously cost saving to the airline?
Yes, for sure. I think that goes for all qualities in on rosters, that they are to a much larger degree defined in pairing than in rostering. And that even applies to in some counterintuitive ways, such as bid satisfaction for preferential bids. Of course, this is something that happens in rostering, but you need to take into consideration what kind of pairings you create in order to have something to give to people that works. But yeah, essentially for everything, the big difference is made in pairing, and in rostering, your hands are tied to a large degree. You can still make things worse, for sure. But yeah, pairing is where it happens with everything in scheduling.
Thanks for that. Yeah, sorry, you've answered that one as well. I've got one here from Felipe in the question box. One aspect of fatigue I find rarely mentioned is the uneven allocation of leave throughout the year. I know that's a problem for our airline as well. In my airline, it is not unheard of to have 8 solid months of work, including through the busy summertime, only getting your annual leave allocation in winter months, often at times when your family and friends are not available. When pushed to extreme, I find even legal rest and days off allocation, even sound night sleeps, just can't make up for the deeper fatigue. Is this kind of fatigue also modeled, monitored, regulated?
No, well, long-term effects of that type is in general not captured by the fatigue models, not any models that I'm aware of. It depends. If the situation is extreme enough that you simply can't have enough recovery sleep, then a model would cover it. But I think if we're looking at long-term, and that long-term doesn't have to be very long, over the course of a couple of months, then there are psychological factors and various biological factors as well that are not captured so easily by just looking at how much sleep you get during. I mean, essentially, from the perspective of fatigue model, no matter how extreme you've been pushed, you'll be good after a week of full rest. So. Yeah, no,
yeah.
Those things are difficult to model.
Okay.
I don't think we have the data to do that.
Yeah. So on the control of model and the value of the data the airline has, I've seen in a lot of airlines, they have bits and pieces of lots of different companies' software all the way back upstream from the schedule production, etc. Do you think there's a value in having an overall integrated system? And do you think these companies can all work together well? I know you've got a bit of a...
Yeah, well, I think one should preferably have an integrated solution delivered by us. But no, I think if we focus on fatigue, that's not really strictly necessary. Not when it comes to measuring, at least. Well, both with Jeppeson's fatigue solutions and with those of our competitors, you can hook them up to multiple systems. It's no problem having one system for manpower, one for pairing, one for rostering, and the fourth one for day of operation. I mean, it becomes more IT work because you have to make sure you have interfaces for everything. So, I mean, there's a cost to having a large diversity of IT systems. I mean, and that's always true, but it's not a hinder, it's not a blocker.
Maria's asking a question. To the costing of fatigue, do airlines correlate cost of disability, so medical leave, with fatigue reporting? Have you seen that done?
I think that happens, or I know that it happens, that airlines, if someone has been burned out, for example, and have a long-term medical leave, well, I mean, different parts of the airline and the relevant medical staff will be looking at past schedules and fatigue reports and other things. But, well, as a vendor, we don't have any insight in this. I mean, these things are handled with a lot of confidentiality. I don't know if anyone actually tries to summarize the costs. I would assume that happens, but that the data is not shared.
Yeah.
But yeah, because I know, I mean, there's a large number of airlines who have very ambitious and quite impressive, I mean, efforts around fatigue management and crew well-being, and who are really good at managing their data. Though, of course, I mean, that's data that I cannot see.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. Here's Chris has got one in here. Rather than surveys to gather info on crew fatigue, what are Arvid's thoughts on carrying out short duration tasks to actually measure fatigue, like vigilance tests such as NASA PVT?
I think those tests are excellent. It's just that they take too much time. And it's not necessarily, when it comes to the PVT test, just about absolute time to find them. But I mean, you need like 10 minutes to do them. And finding 10 minutes is a lot harder than finding 20 seconds, which means, well, it comes down to not letting, I mean, good be the enemy of perfect here. I think it's great. I mean, if you have the ability to do those, then you get a higher precision than you do with subjective ratings. It's just that, I mean, to be honest, that's not going to happen. Then partly because it takes a lot of time, and partly even if you have time, I mean, as a human, doing PVT tests is extremely boring. I mean, I've done a fair number of them myself, and they're just so boring. I mean, that's the point of the test. You need to focus on something extremely boring for a long period of time. But even if you have the time, crew will not do this in a large scale. Because, I mean, why spend 10 minutes doing that when you can look out the window instead? So it's just, yeah.
Yeah. Right.
It's complementary, but it doesn't work for large scale.
Okay, understood. Thanks for that. That's all the questions at the moment. Obviously, maybe more later on. I'll hand you back to Joji now. Oh no, we're good. Yes, Joji, and then the break, I think. Thanks, Arvid.
Thank you.
Great stuff. Thanks, Arvid. Thanks, James, again for the Q&A. So yeah, we've reached kind of the halfway point. I suggest we take a break now, a brief break. Please stay logged on to this Zoom link, or if you need to leave, then to rejoin using the same link. Could I suggest we come back at 5 past the hour? So UK time, that will be 3:05. And we'll then go on to our third presentation from Erin Flynn Evans of NASA, followed by a Q&A. So enjoy a break and see you again at 5 past the hour. Thank you. I hope you're all suitably refreshed and ready to go again for our last presentation this afternoon. It's my pleasure to now introduce Dr. Erin Flynn-Evans, who will provide some fascinating insights into fatigue from a scientific point of view and how they can be mitigated. I should point out that Erin is joining us from the west coast of the USA and has been awake very much during the window of circadian lows, so not optimal scheduling on our part, for which we apologise, but we're extremely grateful for her presence. Erin leads the NASA Ames Research Centre Fatigue Countermeasures Laboratory at NASA Ames Research Centre. She holds a PhD from the University of Surrey and an MPH from the Harvard School of Public Health. Prior to joining NASA, she was an instructor in medicine in the Division of Sleep Medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School. Erin has extensive research experience examining the short and long-term effects of sleep loss and circadian misalignment in occupational settings, including among astronauts, airline pilots, physicians, and other shift workers. The floor is yours, Erin.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joji, and really appreciate the opportunity to speak here to everyone. So, all right, if you can't see my screen, then do let me know.
It's all good, Erin.
Perfect. Thank you. So, yeah, I think that my talk is very complementary to the two that you heard previously. I'm going to talk about fatigue risk management as we move forward in the post-COVID era. So I will be discussing a little bit of the science that we've done in the past coming from pre-COVID times, but I'll focus largely on a survey that we conducted during COVID. And hopefully that sparks some interesting and lively discussion. So for those of you who don't know much about NASA or don't know why someone from NASA might be talking at an aviation focused meeting, I just wanted to start by expressing, what we do at NASA. So NASA is the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. So the first A in NASA is aeronautics, and we do have a very large focus in aeronautics. And what I've plotted here are our 10 NASA centers. And what you can see is we have, our Houston, we have a problem center, which is Johnson Space Center. We have Kennedy Space Center, where we do the majority of our space launches. But we have a variety of other centers as well. And 3 of them are focused on aviation operations. We have Langley, Glenn, and Armstrong. And I'm located up here at Ames Research Center, which is shown with the microscope. And I put a microscope there because, of course, we're a research campus. And so we're doing research as a group to support all of the work that we do in NASA, from astronomy all the way to space biology and aeronautics is a large part of our collective portfolio at Ames as well. Here's our campus. So you can see the San Francisco Bay in the background. We have the world's largest wind tunnel here. You can't quite see it out of the picture, but over by the airfield, we have a large unused dirigible hangar that is quite a landmark. So if you ever fly into San Francisco or San Jose, I recommend just taking a drive down the 101. We have a little gift shop. It's not particularly impressive, but you can check it out and you can see the hangar and see our campus. So in my lab, I lead the fatigue countermeasures laboratory. And as Joji mentioned, I'm a circadian physiologist by training. So I really come at the issues of fatigue as they relate to sort of the core workings of the human. And in my lab, we have 3 primary research areas. We do spaceflight research, of course. I'm not really going to talk about that at all today, but there is a lot of complementary work that we do in spaceflight that informs our aeronautics research. And then similarly, much of the aeronautics work that we do informs our spaceflight work. And we use the exact same tools in these 2 research areas. So for example, we have activity monitors to measure sleep. Sometimes we have these little electrode systems to measure sleep, both in spaceflight and in aeronautics. So there is a lot of translation between the 2. And then we also support mission operations. So I'm sure many of you know about the Perseverance rover that is currently driving around Mars. And when scientists and engineers work on those types of missions, they have to adopt a Mars day-length schedule, which poses many challenges when it comes to sleep and circadian rhythms, because just a little fun fact here to start the talk, Mars rotates at 24 hours and 39 minutes. And so it's very, very similar to what we have here on Earth. But as you can imagine, it's like a perpetual jet lag. The scientists and engineers have to shift their sleep later and later by 39 minutes every day in order to conduct those operations. And so we support those mission ops to provide the people who are working on those missions with tools and countermeasures that they can use to help them stay alert and get the rest that they need at the right times. I'll also note with our aeronautics work, while we are a US government agency, we do have partnerships around the world. And so I am familiar with the regulations in Europe and other countries. We, again, use the work that we do both in the US and with our international partners to just help safety. So at NASA, our aeronautics work is really falls under the umbrella of safety. We're not a regulator. We are doing research to support safety and to feed our regulators with information that can then be used and translated into better practices and better regulation, really. So I'm going to just first define fatigue. So I know you've heard the definition of fatigue a couple of times now, but I think fatigue is such a non-specific term that it is really important that whenever you're talking about fatigue, it is really important that you understand what that definition means, because if you leave it up to one's imagination, it could mean many different things. So I'll give you our definition of fatigue, or what we adopt as that definition of fatigue at NASA. I'll give you a couple of quick examples of fatigue and countermeasure studies that we've done at NASA. I chose just a little short haul vignette and then a long haul vignette to share with you. I could probably have an entire talk on short haul or long haul, but I thought it would be most interesting to focus on a survey that we recently conducted to understand how the pandemic has been affecting fatigue among pilots. And I think while this survey was US based, I think that many of the themes that we learned from the survey will translate and resonate with those of you who are participating today. So to start, we generally adopt the ICAO definition of fatigue. And so going back to some of the discussion that was happening earlier, it's really the primary causes of fatigue are, sleep loss, circadian misalignment, but also workload comes into the picture in this particular definition. And we're interested in all of these issues with a particular focus, as you've heard before, on the physiology. And so workload is something that for us also kind of comes in second. So we think workload is important, but we first want to understand how sleep loss, circadian misalignment, and poor sleep quality are affecting one's alertness level. And so just to define these, acute sleep loss is staying up longer than you should all at once. Chronic sleep loss, not getting enough sleep on a regular basis. Poor sleep quality, of course, disrupted sleep. We've all experienced that from time to time. And then circadian misalignment, which is effectively working against your own body clock. So being awake when your body wants you to be asleep, or being asleep when your body wants you to be awake. And each of these areas poses challenges independently, but when they interact, they lead to just an elevated level of fatigue expression among individuals. So diving right into it, for our short haul work, there are several issues that we're studying in short haul. And I'm not going to talk about all of these. I don't think that I have time. But this is just more for awareness. So of course, we're interested in duty start time on sleep, alertness, and performance. And we're interested in understanding how schedule variability, the construction of rosters, again, things that you've already heard about today, affect alertness and performance. We're very interested in back of the clock flying in the short haul space in particular, because of course, we've had a lot of research that's been done over the years on long haul flying and certainly long haul back of the clock flying, but there's been less attention paid to short haul back of the clock flying. And so we're about to start a very large study looking at back of the clock flying specifically to better understand the challenges associated with that, including workload on alertness and performance. And then with the information that we gain from these short haul studies, it's not really just about the scientific endeavor of understanding that there is a problem or characterizing an issue. It's about learning so that we can then develop strategies and mitigations to counter the effects of fatigue that we see. And there are many ways that we can do that. And so I think scheduling, optimizing schedules is sort of the foundation. And again, I think that's a recurring theme that you're hearing today. But then once you have those optimal schedules, as my co-panelists have pointed out, you're still going to have some level of fatigue because simply working at times when your body is, promoting sleep will impact your sleepiness level, your fatigue level. So unless we abandon working at night altogether, we're going to have some residual fatigue, even with the best possible schedules. And so that's where these additional countermeasures come into play. So we're doing several studies looking at using light to help shift the circadian rhythm, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And that can help improve alertness and performance. We're looking at strategic use of caffeine. I've definitely been using caffeine very strategically this morning since I got up at 4 to hopefully keep me alert enough to get through this talk. And then of course, napping. And I'll talk a little bit more about just some of the work that we're doing with napping more as we talk about long haul. But all of these tools are potential countermeasures that we can apply once we identify a problem. So I'm just, again, going to give you just one quick example of a study that we have done in short haul. So how can daytime short haul flights influence sleep? So I think a lot of people, I don't imagine many people who are on this in this meeting would find this an unfamiliar topic, but when you talk to the general population, many people will say, well, how can working during the day be a problem? How can that cause fatigue? How can that affect your sleep? But of course, we know that daytime flights don't necessarily mean that you are working exclusively during sort of the 9 to 5 typical daytime hours. Daytime flights can mean that you're getting up early or you're ending quite late. And so just to revisit some of the physiology here, if you normally go to bed around 11 o'clock and you normally wake up around 7 in the morning, your circadian rhythm will be nicely aligned with your sleep episode. And so this melatonin curve that I've plotted here is just a reflection of where our circadian rhythm is phased. So when melatonin peaks, you're going to have a very strong drive to sleep, your performance will be lower, and it will be very difficult to maintain wakefulness. And so if you're sleeping during this time, things are going pretty well. You'll probably have a nice consolidated bout of sleep. But if you have to wake up for an early, then what's going to happen is something that Paul talked about earlier, and that is you're going to, if you're trying to get the rest that you need in order to get a full sleep episode, you might try to go to bed very early. And in this case, if we're talking about person going to bed at 7 or 8 p.m., that's going to fall right in what's called the wake maintenance zone, or a lot of people call it the forbidden zone for sleep. It's very challenging to fall asleep in this time. So even if you're very conscientious and you're trying to get that earlier sleep, and even if you are able to avoid the social pressures that come with staying up later. You may get into bed and you may not be able to sleep very well at all, despite your attempt. And of course, you still have to get up very early in order to perform your work. So that's one way that shifting your sleep in order to work during the day can affect potentially your alertness and subsequent performance. Of course, we have the flip side as well for late finishes. You're staying up later than normal. We know that this is associated with decreased performance and shorter sleep, because often what happens is, of course, you have to, maybe you finish and you are, perhaps in pretty good form at midnight, not too much beyond when you normally go to bed. But then you have to commute and have some wind down time before you can finally fall asleep. So it may be several hours after your normal bedtime before you're getting home for a late finish. And sleeping in can be challenged both by social obligations, but also by your circadian rhythm. So as you approach your normal wake time, you'll start to feel more alert. And if you're sleeping, you'll have this wake signal potentially causing you to wake up. Sometimes you can sleep through it, but sometimes you can't. And in addition to that, you have environmental factors like the sun rising. And so if you don't have adequate blackout material in the room that you're sleeping in, you may find it very difficult to sleep in. And so these are the types of questions that we're interested in understanding as we mine some of the data that we had. We really just wanted to look at what is the impact of different work start times on sleep. And so what I have here is a table just showing the breakdown of a couple of studies that we did combined that shows that in fact on earlies, crew got shorter sleep relative to late flights. And so with this particular study, we just broke down the work shifts based on the type of duty that was happening. And so we considered baseline sort of later morning flights, early afternoon flights, flights basically that wouldn't encroach on the sleep episode, that were not particularly difficult, not particularly high workload, easy by most people's definition. Early starts were, again, defined as one might expect, generally flights that were starting before 6 in the morning. And that would require one to go to bed significantly earlier before they were able to get up and do the flight. Midday was, again, sort of middle of the day, a little higher workload flights. And then our late finishes we categorized as any flight that was ending, say, after 9 or 10 p.m. And with this data, we were happy but surprised that the lates were not really associated with a reduction in sleep. As you can see, this is total sleep time, and these are hours. And so we can see that at baseline and on days off, we see a nice average of just under 7 hours. And this is measured objectively. So this is with a wrist-worn activity monitor. But of course, we can see with earlies, crews lose about an hour of sleep, which isn't probably too surprising to many of the people on this call. So of course, the question with this is, well, what can you do? Because this really, when it comes down to it, isn't so much a scheduling issue. This is a human physiology issue. And so when we think about the things that we can do to better enable people to get sleep on earlies, one of the things that we think about a lot in my lab, and particularly for the work that we do in spaceflight, is how do we shift the circadian rhythm, for example, so the astronauts can be ready to receive a visiting vehicle if that vehicle is coming up at a time when the crew would otherwise be asleep. And the way that we do this is through strategic use of light exposure. And so what we find, and that, well, this is not just what we find, this is a conserved biological principle, that light in the morning shifts the drive to sleep and wake earlier, while light in the evening shifts the drive to sleep and wake later. And so we've done several studies now where we find that there is actually a beneficial effect to morning light exposure, whether that's exposure to just morning sunlight. So now, you know, in the Northern Hemisphere, we're approaching the summer solstice. So we have pretty early sunrises, depending where we are in the time zone. So just getting out and getting exposed to that early morning light can help improve alertness. And then similarly, in the winter, when we don't have, you know, the benefit of the sun to help us in the morning, or when you have to get up before the sun rises, even in the summertime, you can use supplemental lighting. And so we're in an era where there have been huge advances in lighting technology, and we can use lighting, enhanced lighting regimes that are basically light bulbs that mimic what the sun does, mimic the spectrum and the intensity and wavelength of sunlight to help improve alertness. And not only does bright light first thing in the morning help you just feel more alert. If you wake up and the sun is shining and you go outside, you'll feel much more alert than if you wake up and you go outside and it's dark. So there's that acute alerting effect, but there's also the potential benefit that if you have a series of earlies and you're exposing yourself to bright light first thing in the morning, you should be able to help accelerate the shift of your circadian rhythm, thereby improving your alertness and performance, and improving your ability to get sleep. So you should be able to fall asleep faster. But of course, that relies on having a schedule that's conducive to that. So an irregular schedule, would not lend itself very well to using this type of countermeasure. So it has to be used at the right time, under the right circumstances, in order to be effective. And then I'll just note here, the second half of this graph shows that light in the evening shifts the drive to sleep and wake later. And so we didn't really see any negative impact on sleep overall in our cohort. But for individuals who are sleeping late because they're working late, evening light has sort of the opposite effect of morning light. And so you can, if you have a string of lates and you generally have difficulty sleeping in, you can counteract that by evening light exposure, which can then help shift your circadian rhythm later. But again, I want to emphasize that this is a very specific type of countermeasure that can only be used when you have a schedule that is conducive to this type of application. So it would have to be a series. And then one final note on the work that we've done on light, because light at different times does different things, it's of no help if you expose yourself to bright light in the evening and then bright light in the morning. That will counter both of those light exposures will counteract one another. And so to really make this effective, if you, again, for the example of an early start, have an early start and you're trying to go to bed early, you want to bring those lights down in advance of your bedtime. You want to try to avoid being exposed to bright light, like from your screens, your computer, phone, tablet, whatever it may be, and then use that light strategically in the morning. So from these studies, we find early starts are associated with shorter sleep. Late finishes really weren't associated with a big deficit in sleep. And this is probably because people find it easier to sleep in, and that's been shown before as well. Bright light in the morning helps shift the circadian rhythm earlier. And light also has an acute alerting effect. And so, in using this type of technique, I certainly don't want to imply that light can solve all problems. This is just a supplement to help maybe think of it like a cup of coffee. You might have a cup of coffee in order to help you feel a little bit more alert. You can use light in a similar manner. So shifting gears to give you an example of one of our long haul studies. So firstly, just the issues that we're studying in long haul are quite diverse and different than what we're studying in short haul. Here, one of the big issues that has come up over and over is the timing of in-flight rest breaks and how that affects sleep sleep quality, sleep quantity, and then subsequent alertness and performance. And so with in-flight rest, we find that some airlines prescribe when pilot crews are supposed to sleep, supposed to take their in-flight rest. And in the US, we have regulations that require that pilots on certain operations take certain rest breaks. And so we're very interested in understanding what impact this might have on alertness and performance at top of descent. We also are looking at just the bunk environment on its own. And this comes up as I'll talk about the survey that we've done with COVID. We find that crews are sometimes having to sleep in the bunk on layovers, which is an unusual situation. And, we know that there may be some discomforts in the bunks that make it not the best place for an extended sleep opportunity on the ground. We're also doing a lot of work looking at controlled rest. So in the US, controlled rest is not legal, airlines are not able to use controlled rest. And so we're interested in understanding just from our international partners how it's used and whether or not it's effective. And then we have a few other tasks, so very large portfolio here, but we're looking at departure time and the effect on alertness and performance. Again, many people have looked at this before, and so we're just adding another dimension in the work that we're doing here. And then we're looking at pilot acclimation. So I believe someone asked a question of Paul earlier about acclimation and about the data that's used to support different regulation. Here we're very interested in this as well, and understanding, like what is the rate of acclimation in different scenarios, and are there scenarios where in fact it might actually be better not to acclimate. But for this particular case, I'm just going to tell you about our in-flight rest work. So as I mentioned before, we have a regulation in the US that requires pilots who are doing 3 pilot operations, which are approximately 8 to 13-hour flights, for the landing pilots to take the 3rd rest break, or landing pilot to take the 3rd rest break. And we're concerned about this particular requirement because sleep inertia, which is the grogginess that you experience upon waking, or some people call it a sleep hangover, can hang on for quite a long time. And so we had some concerns that maybe sleep inertia could influence alertness and performance if a pilot's taking the 3rd rest break and then being expected to get up quickly and then perform landing duties. And so that was the primary reason for our study. But we're also interested in just some of the environmental issues and understanding, what is actually influencing, one's quality of sleep in the bunk. And so, again, just one quick little data slide here to summarize our findings. But basically what we found is that, I'll draw your attention to this sleep duration panel. And we found that on the 1st rest break and the 3rd rest break, pilots got significantly less sleep than on the 2nd. And again, just talking to pilots, this was not particularly surprising. We heard this over and over before we did the study. So, this is kind of key to allowing crews now to modify the timing of the rest break based on what they think will afford them the right sleep at the right time. And so so of course the regulation isn't changing. That's a huge process. But in the US, we do have some opportunity that airlines can be granted exceptions to certain rules. And so in this case, the carriers that we worked with are able to now allow pilots to vary their rest break timing in order to optimize their sleep. We did, though, find it's important to note, again, going back to the sort of the biology of it, sleep duration was longest from around 6 to 10 home base time, irrespective of break order. So that's sort of a little, delayed relative to a typical night. But as you stay awake through the night and your sleepiness increases, this isn't terribly surprising, and this is some evidence that supports that internal clock is still promoting sleep. So we don't want to suggest that rest break 2 will always be the best. It's just that on average, we find that pilots do get a little bit more rest on that sleep opportunity relative to the others. But there are factors that will come up in any individual flight that will determine when the optimal rest break is for a given pilot. And then, of course, one of the big questions that we had in looking at this data was what is the impact on alertness. And so the Samparelli, I'm sure you're all familiar with, is a fatigue scale. And we find that the pilots reported themselves as being more fatigued on average following the third rest break than the second. And these measures were taken at top of descent. The KSS showed a similar pattern. KSS is the Karolinska Sleepiness Scale. Arvid talked a bit about this. And the KSS was higher, indicating that pilots rated themselves as sleepier at top of descent after the third rest break compared to the second. So when we looked at the breakdown of the causes of poor quality sleep in the bunk on really any of these rest breaks, we find that the top 3 were cabin noise, uncomfortable mattress, and turbulence. And again, this wasn't particularly surprising. This is what we'd heard prior to conducting this study. But in particular, we found that on these types of operations, the first and third rest breaks often coincided with cabin service. And so that caused more disruption depending on the location of the galley relative to the rest facility. There were varying grades of disruption, but the second rest break was viewed as superior by the majority of pilots. And we heard in the comments to our study that largely that's because it allowed for the longest opportunity of uninterrupted sleep. So from this, we take that pilots should understand that the second rest break does afford longer sleep and better alertness at top of descent on average in this type of operation. And in the US, that's translated into allowing the landing pilots the option to take the second rest break as opposed to requiring that they continue to take the third. We find that better and longer sleep coincides with sort of that late night, early morning home base time, sort of time of day effect. And so again, I want to emphasize, I'm not suggesting that the second rest break is always better, but the second rest break can be better. And we conclude that pilots should be allowed autonomy to choose in-flight rest timing. So while there is some value perhaps in assigning the timing of rest breaks, in many cases, personal factors, ability to achieve sufficient rest, the timing of your home base time will all influence whether or not you're able to sleep at a given time. And so that in-flight rest break timing is best determined by crews of pilots making the decision about who will take what break when they begin the flight. So switching gears to the last part of my talk, we over the last year, we've really reflected on the work that we've done because, of course, everything changed. I don't have to talk much about that, but the many issues really came to our attention as potential concerns as the pandemic took shape. For example, we were seeing hyperaugmentation, with pilots sleeping on the aircraft during layovers. We're seeing lots of retirements, and so lots of experience kind of leaving the workforce. We're seeing lots of turnover in our ground staff, and so potential translation to weight and balance issues and more workload for pilots. We're seeing just like a variety of stressors that pilots were telling us about, like just the stress of potentially being furloughed, affecting their, kind of bleeding into their day and their work. And so we decided to conduct a survey last year. This is, again, a US focused survey, but I think a lot of the sentiments that the pilots expressed in this survey will translate to other pilot populations around the world. So with that, this was, we had a population of 669 pilots with a pretty good breakdown of captains and first officers, pretty good experience level overall. You can see that the operation was dominated by passenger carrier pilots, although we had a few cargo and a few operators who did both. What we find, just again, across the survey, is that first officers have really been hit the hardest in the US. So 17% of first officers were displaced compared to 8% of captains. 35% of first officers lost currency due to reduction in flight hours compared to 20% of captains. 9% first officers lost currency due to training facility shutdown compared to 8% of captains. 19% of first officers started flying cargo compared to 10% of captains. And 7% of first officers reported being furloughed compared to less than 1% of captains. When we look at how the pandemic affected flight and duty time, we don't really see much difference across the board. And so of those pilots who were still flying at the time of this survey, there's maybe a slight dip down here in the orange is in the past month and the blue is prior to COVID. So maybe a slight dip down from the 8 to 12 hour range to the 4 to 8 hour, but overall, no huge differences here. When we look at work per month, not surprisingly, we see a small reduction in duty days and a reduction in flight hours. Again, in a survey dominated by passenger carrier pilots, this is not particularly surprising. And then when we look at the influence of the pandemic on flight hours and duty days relative to pre-pandemic by operator, so cargo is in blue, both in purple, passenger carriers in red, and then the entire cohort in gray, we can see that overall there's a decrease in duty days. And that was largely due to the decrease in passenger carriers. Again, not particularly surprising here, where we saw a sort of no change to an increase in flight hours in cargo and joint carriers. When we look at sleep specifically, we don't really see a huge change. And this surprised us a little bit, but again, these are only, in this particular plot, only pilots who were continuing to fly. And so we didn't really see a big change among the pilots who participated in the survey or across types of operation. And then when we look at self-reported sleepiness, again, not a huge change, but perhaps a slight increase here in sleepiness among cargo operators. In-flight sleepiness, we do see a slight increase overall. So that's here. And then when we looked at use of countermeasures, again, not a huge change in the use of countermeasures across the operation. Again, blue is prior to COVID and orange is the past month, so pretty similar across the board. And finally, when we look at layover sleep quality on the aircraft versus hotel, we didn't have a whole lot of people who were affected by this in our survey. There's just a handful, but we see the peak in fair to poor, which again is not surprising. Aircraft were not really meant for sleeping on for extended durations of time. So we hope to collect more data on this particular topic in the future, but we also don't think that it's a great practice based on what we've seen. So that, is the data, but I think the really rich value in this particular survey is that we allowed some open responses. And in these open responses, we let pilots tell us what issues they were experiencing, because we talk to pilots all the time, but having the direct feedback on what's happening on the ground is really important, especially to have that feedback organized in a way where we can really better understand the issues like in this survey. And so one of the biggest issues that pilots noted in the comments was lack of access to exercise and food. And again, I think hopefully things are getting better now. But at the time of the survey last year, we got lots of comments like this. My increase in fatigue is due to lack of activity. In many locations, we're not allowed to leave the hotel, walk or run just to get fresh air and a hot meal. Additionally, not being able to work out in most fitness facilities means I'm out of shape and my sleep is less restful. And there is some science to support that, exercise and sleep have a close relationship. And so, having being more in shape is associated with better sleep. So I think while this is an anecdotal response, there's some really important information here. And then on the same topic, another pilot, tells us about really the lack of food issues. So I'll just highlight, this pilot says, on more than one occasion, I've had nothing to eat for an entire day. That's really a concern. So while lack of food and dehydration doesn't really come into our definition of fatigue as I described it earlier, this is a big concern because we know that fasting has interactions with sleepiness as well. I'm not sure that all of those interactions are really known at this point, but certainly we've flagged this as an area of concern that we should look at going forward. The next big thing that came up were scheduling factors. And so while on average, I showed you that there weren't huge differences in flight time or duty time, there are weird things happening that we're hearing from pilots. So for example, it seems my duty days have gotten much longer, but I'm not flying as much. I often have 2+ hours between flights, which results in significantly longer duty periods. And so this downtime is also a concern, just the waiting around, just change from normal operations has been difficult to deal with. Similarly, we had lots of comments, as you can imagine, on this topic. Of interest, I think not everyone complained about the change in duty. So you can see the first 2 comments here are fairly negative in shifting from typically early duty days to maybe more later duty days, leading to fatigue. But this last comment was interesting to us in that one person kind of felt they benefited from having fewer earlies and were able to get better rest as a result. We're also seeing increased stress. So again, in the US, one big complaint that pilots expressed in the survey was, really just the unknowns, like the threat of furlough, not knowing what's going on, trying to just bank as much work as possible in case a furlough were to come, the inability to sleep due to the stress of potential furlough. All of these issues are a great concern to us. And, these are things that require mitigation. And I was hoping that Paul would be able to talk about wellness right after me to help give some tools and strategies for dealing with this type of stress. But perhaps he'll be able to come back at another time, because I think this is a big issue, and will probably linger even as we return to full operation. Increased workload and distractions were also something that came up here. So longer security lines, more checklists to follow related to COVID. This particular pilot notes that the pilots, flight attendants, ops agents are all getting distracted because they're thinking about COVID, talking about COVID, complaining about COVID. And this particular pilot raises the point that this, leads to distraction from the higher priorities of work. Again, the entire process has become more exhausting. Security takes longer, and there's so much more to do. So all of these issues, again, are new and are concerning and are things that we're flagging to examine in more detail as we go forward. So overall, again, this is just a cross-sectional survey. We just wanted to understand the landscape a little bit better in a more structured manner. And so from this, we take that, we really, we have limited data on sleeping on the aircraft, but what we do see suggests that it's not a good practice. So we recommend that carriers should provide alternatives to sleeping on aircraft, more transparency about schedules and about job security to the extent as possible, wellness programs to help pilots manage stress, reliable access to food and exercise, particularly as we go forward, where there may be destinations where such access remains difficult. Clear communication about changing company and destination policies regarding the pandemic. I realize everyone is just scrambling to stay up with what's happening in the world, but with the constant changing, I think in many cases we're seeing that pilots feel like they're they're having a lot of distraction in trying to keep up. And then we think, as we go forward with the airline partners that we work with, we're building targeted fatigue risk management programs to provide resources to pilots who are experiencing more severe fatigue, like the operators who have shifted to more heavy cargo operations from passenger service. So we plan to do additional surveys as things ramp up to sort of hopefully watch how things unfold and to provide continued recommendation back to the industry. So with that, I'll say thank you. I'm happy to take questions if there's time. And this is the team. I just want to acknowledge in particular Dr. Cassie Hilditch, who led the COVID survey that I presented. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Erin. That was an incredibly absorbing presentation, particularly around the effects of light exposure. I mean, personally speaking, having a reasonably stable schedule, there's certainly takeaways that I can put into practice, such as access to light sources in the morning, particularly during the winter months here. I'll now hand over to James to field questions on Erin's presentation. Over to you, James.
Thanks. We'll start with Ian, who's asking, to what extent do you look at actual time of awakening rather than start of duty time? For many pilots, a report at 0600 hours actually means awakening at 4:20 in the morning. Allowing 30 minutes to get ready and now to drive is not uncommon. Then add in the need to sign in earlier than stated report time so that you avoid getting a late report record, etc. Do you take that into account when you're doing your work?
We do, yeah. So we have an analysis of, again, sort of aggregated data that we've collected across many different groups, where we're looking at time of day effects related to time since waking. And so, time since waking matters more than duty start time, really, when assessing the impact of fatigue. So we absolutely agree that that's a big concern, and we are looking at it. It's a little more challenging to assess commuting impacts in the US because it's a more sensitive topic. And so we have less data probably than I would prefer on the commuting topic. And but we certainly will at least have time since waking on the day of an operation for every study that we do. And we do factor that into our analysis. Right.
In the UK, I mean, we do, I think the flying went down considerably more than the US. So I may have missed it in your presentation, but do you factor in that increased cognitive load when people come back from lack of experience and apply that to the issue?
Such a good question. I mean, this is a big concern that we're watching now, and you know, we do generally collect experience information as part of our demographic data collection for all of the studies that we do. We do factor it into our analyses. And so, for example, when doing analyses, you can create statistical models where you can sort of feed in factors that you think might help explain what you're seeing. And so experience is certainly one that we feed into these models. However, in the past, we haven't really found that experience had a huge impact at all. Generally, it got kicked out of the model. But, you know, again, that doesn't mean that it won't be an issue in the future, because again, kind of thinking about the US case in particular, with retirements, you know, we're going to have, in the past, we've had very experienced captains, you know, maybe working with, you know, somewhat less experienced first officers. Now we may have captains who are less experienced, and I don't want to say like less experienced as in that's a negative thing or they're not qualified. Certainly they're qualified, but rather maybe they're less experienced on a particular route and haven't had, you know, the opportunity to go into a particular city, you know, 50 times like a captain may have 2 years ago. And so we really don't understand what the impact will be on having that lesser experience going forward. But it is something that we want to continue to collect data on and assess. But I don't know the answer right now.
Okay. I've got a slightly personal one. When our airline switched from crew rooms to report to aircraft, so we bypassed the crew rooms altogether. One of the problems around that is the issue of needing a cognitive switch between the home person and the working person. So you have two different identities there, and the lack of a ritual around that. And I know in other industries it's caused issues where safety people have removed rituals that seemed pointless at the start of work and they've had problems. Is that an issue for when you're really early starts for fatigue? Can you bypass that, bypass the cognitive switch and not be ready to work? Do you see what I mean? Has anyone ever thought of that?
Yeah, I do see what you're saying. Yeah, I think, you know, what you're pointing to is really the complexity of the current era that we're in, and the interactions of the impact of COVID with issues like fatigue from early starts. You know, so one, I don't think that this precise topic has been studied. You know, again, Paul or Arvid may know of studies that I am not aware of. But I would say, you know, generally changing procedures can be quite, you know, quite challenging, even if you're not fatigued. It's hard to get into the mindset of following a new procedure when you've always done something in a certain way. And so, as you say, you know, having that point to change over and, you know, get into the mindset that to fly in the way that you've always done, you know, is a concern. And you know, I imagine there are probably some interactions, but I would say there are probably mitigations that don't involve just, you know, going back to business as usual. So maybe mitigation is that you know, you're on the flight deck earlier so that you can, you know, have a little bit more downtime processing time. Again, you may have even better ideas than I do, but I think, you know, change is possible. Having that shift in sort of cognitive ability is important, and there probably are interactions, but I wouldn't say that it would cause me so much concern that, you know, the practice should stop immediately or anything like that.
Okay, thanks for that. What's the current thinking on how much you can move your circadian rhythm per day?
Yeah, not a lot. So you know, if you do nothing, you know, you'll probably shift just with normal, if we're talking about normal sort of room light, you'll probably shift, you know, maybe half hour earlier a day. So not, you know, you will shift. Absolutely. Room light has an effect. But if you use brighter, more intense light, you can gain greater shifts, an hour to an hour and a half. So you're not going to adapt to an early start all at once. One day of light exposure is not going to do it, but it certainly can help. So that's really what it's all about. It's just kind of laying that foundation to be able to adapt a little bit better. And again, not normal room light exposure will do it. The sun is, you know, the best friend that you have and will have the biggest impact, which is why if you think of a jet lag situation, we don't generally think about using light to shift for jet lag, but the new photo period and the time zone we're in does all the work for us.
You're better with the natural light than the, I mean, obviously there's natural light lamps, isn't there? Is that or can you just use a normal turn lights on light?
Yeah, well, so normal light, you know, will have an impact, but the brighter and the bluer the light, the better the impact, the faster you'll shift. And so you want to have a light that, you know, is in the blue spectrum, because our circadian system is more sensitive to blue wavelength light, and then more intense. So those types of sunlight lamps, often they're sold for seasonal affective disorder. Those are the types of lights that are most useful for shifting the circadian rhythm.
All right, thanks for that. That's pretty much what I have for the moment, unless anybody has anything else. I'm going to hand it back to Joji, and he's going to wrap it up, and then I'll speak to you again in a few minutes.
Thank you, James, and thank you, Erin, again. So we've now finished presentations for today, and we'd like to now move to the panel Q&A session. As there haven't been too many questions formally raised via the Q&A box, what we suggest, if you're okay with this and bear with us, is moving to the informal discussion platform now. So at the beginning of the session, I mentioned there was this opportunity for a bit of informal chat. So by doing that, we'll allow people to actually speak, you know, raise their questions verbally and appear on camera. And James will explain shortly what you need to do exactly to get into this platform. However, it does mean we do need to leave this Zoom session. So what I'll do is I'll just say a few closing words now for those unable to make the switch, or, you know, if you have to leave us now. And then I'll hand over to James, who will explain what to do next. So on behalf of James and I, again, a big thank you to all of our speakers, Paul, Arvid, Erin. I hope you found the experience as rewarding as we did through listening to you. Thanks also to the audience for your attendance, your interest, comments, questions. I hope you've learned something new, or at the very least, this has been quite a useful reminder of what you may already know, a bit of a revision of how you can more effectively manage your alertness and optimize your sleep going forward. Just to remind again that we'll bring you the specific wellbeing piece with Paul Cullen later. So we'll film that, put it on the website, and let you know it's there. Again, as I've said many times before on these conferences we've run, we hope to keep the safety conversation going and learning together about these sort of progressive safety subjects through the medium of these webinars while we're still using them. So to that end, we'd be grateful if you could fill in a short feedback questionnaire saying what you like about these, what could be better, what subjects you'd like to be covered in the future. And we'll put that questionnaire on the Safety Conference website. So that's safetyconference.balpa.org, safetyconference.balpa.org. And we'll also obviously put the recording of this session there together with the presentations. So once again, thanks to you all. Take care, stay safe, and hopefully see you again. I'll now pass you over to James, who will explain what to do next. All the best. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Joji. For those of you who want to join us and ask questions in person, we've found an online app that is very useful for this. It's almost like the bar after the conference. It's called Wander Room. I've put the link there in the chat, but the link is also on our safety website. So if you head over to that, all you need to do is put in your name and take a picture of yourself and move yourself around to interact with the people there. I'll leave the Zoom conference running for 5-10 minutes while everyone finds the link, and then we'll finish it up. Yeah, again, thanks to everybody, and hopefully see you in the Wonder Room. Thank you.